Today I finally get to tell you how the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer drive out on the road. If you haven't already seen part 1 of this video, then be sure and check that out after you've watched this. The link is going to be down there in the description. There's also going to be a link at the end of the video. Let's just get right into the drive of the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer. Obviously, the first thing you need to know about the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer is that they're big, over 214 inches long. That means that this is just a hair larger than the shortest version of General Motors' large full-size SUVs. The next thing you should know is that there are a few different four-wheel drive systems offered, 2 different engines, and 2 basic suspension systems. There's a steel spring suspension, and then there's the adaptive air ride suspension that I've been spending most of my time in today. The 5.7-liter engine is found in the Wagoneer, the 6.4 in the Grand Wagoneer. Clearly, the Grand Wagoneer is going to be the faster model, but it doesn't produce as much torque as the 6.4-liter engine does in some other vehicles with the SRT tunes. That's likely due to the intake and exhaust manifold design that they have in this particular vehicle in order to quiet things down, make it more luxury car appropriate. 0 to 60 happened in this particular model in 6.5 seconds. That's my preliminary time. I haven't been able to test this obviously out in California. I'm on the opposite side of the country, and it has been a little bit warm here. It's also pretty humid. So climatic conditions are not identical to where I normally test vehicles. I wasn't able to spend too much time with the 5.7-liter V8, but because that engine produces less power and a little bit less torque than this engine, logically 0 to 60 took a little bit longer, about 0.75 seconds longer in that particular model. That's still a pretty respectable time, and it does mean that the 5.7 appears to be faster than the 5.3-liter V8 that we find in most of the General Motors competition. In my preliminary testing, it took 125 feet for this vehicle to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's pretty respectable for a vehicle that weighs well over 6,000 pounds. One definite difference between the 5.7 and the 6.4 is that the 6.4 seems to have a greater sense of urgency. It also has a really great exhaust note. Now, this does not sound as loud, as burbly, as sort of unfinished as the Durango 392 or the Grand Cherokee 392, or of course, the Wrangler 392. There are a ton of different Stellantis products that have this same 6.4-liter V8. And that's because this engine was tweaked a little bit for use under this hood. It's not the same tune that we find in the Ram 2500, interestingly enough. This one produces more horsepower than the one in the 3/4-ton Ram, but less than we find in most of the SRT products. The bigger difference is in the torque curve and the peak torque. This produces a lot of torque at lower RPM still, but they did reduce that peak torque a little bit because of the air intake and the exhaust changes. Those exhaust changes, again, are primarily sound deadening. It's not as burbly, as throaty, as growly as the SRT tune, but it still has that really great exhaust note. You know that there is a big V8 engine under the hood when you floor it. You'll also know that it has a big V8 engine, of course, when you stop at the gas station, because this gets approximately 15 miles per gallon according to the EPA. And over a week of mixed driving and, honestly, a whole lot of idling, I've been averaging considerably lower than that. According to the trip computer, my day-long average ends up right around 12 mpg. That's not overly fair because this spent hours idling. Keep that in mind. I think a better example is that on my way here from New York City to where I am right now, that's about 60 miles outside New York City towards Connecticut, I averaged 22 miles per gallon. Most of that trip was done at around 60 to 65 miles an hour, which is a pretty relaxed highway driving speed. You can expect to get 20 miles per gallon out on the open highway as long as you're being gentle on the throttle. And I believe that 15 miles per gallon average is probably achievable depending on exactly what your balance of city driving and highway driving really ends up being. During my day with the Grand Wagoneer, this adaptive air suspension really impressed me. It has a great feel to it. It doesn't feel wallowy in the corners. It has really good control over the vehicle and really good damping for rougher roads. Now, I don't think that this suspension soaks up some of the larger potholes and imperfections out on the road quite as well as the General Motors suspension setup, which uses a combination of airbags as well as magnetic dampers. I spent the first part of my day out on rougher roads in New York City, and out there, I don't think that this suspension soaks up some of those repetitive bumps and cracks in the road quite as well as the top-end suspension that we find in the General Motors SUVs. That has a pretty unique design. It combines airbags for the lift of the vehicle to control the ride height, and then it combines that with a magnetic damper system to control the damping of the vehicle. It also has the ability to control a little bit, at least, the sway and the tip and dive in the vehicle. The Grand Wagoneer, on the other hand, uses a more traditional adaptive air suspension. It has a little bit of control over the damping, but primarily this suspension is controlling the ride height in the vehicle. I've been driving this without a bunch of passengers inside, and I was able to drive a more fully laden model That did have a slightly better ride, as you'll see in something like a Lincoln Navigator. But this suspension definitely is more compliant, more comfortable, more easy to live with than what we find in the Lincoln. One thing that's always surprised me is that the previous generation General Motors SUVs, the GM SUVs without the air ride suspension, and of course the Lincoln Navigator, they're really not that comfortable for people in the back if you don't have a lot of weight in the vehicle. So if it's an executive transport vehicle and there are 2 people in the back and not a lot of cargo in the rear, the ride is honestly kind of like a cabbage cart. And that's not what we see in vehicles like this with an adaptive air suspension, or of course in the Cadillac Escalade with its air suspension as well. Thanks to the combination of the adaptive airbags and a 4-corner fully independent suspension, this does a really good job handling even out on rougher roads, even in corners where the pavement could be a little bit uneven. The rear suspension never feels upset in those conditions. But obviously, when you start pushing the Wagoneer or Grand Wagoneer a little bit harder, you'll notice that this is not a Grand Cherokee. The Grand Cherokee definitely has a better on-road feel than the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer. It's simply due to the size of the vehicle, the fact that this is a body-on-frame vehicle, so it's going to be a little bit less connected to the driver in terms of steering. I don't have any official cabin noise scores for this vehicle just yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up around 69 decibels, because that's approximately where the Ram 1500 is in the top-end trims, and this is just about as hushed as that Ram truck. The reason for that is that this also is a body-on-frame vehicle, and generally speaking, body-on-frame vehicles are more isolated because I'm riding in the body, the frame is where the tires and the engine are connected, and the body and the frame are isolated from one another. So, especially when this vehicle is in 4-cylinder mode, you hear it an awful lot less in the cabin. I was able to tow a 7,000-pound trailer around for about 30 minutes or so, and you will seriously notice the difference when you have a trailer connected as well. In a unibody vehicle, the trailer is connected to the body of the vehicle because that's all that you have is the body of the vehicle. That's something that I've commented on every time I've driven a unibody vehicle, including the unibody vehicle that I own to tow with. It's just going to be louder when towing. So if you're going to spend hours and hours out on the road towing your boat, towing your horse, towing your whatever, this is going to be a much quieter ride than something like a Durango or the Grand Cherokee L because of that isolation between the frame and the body. This does an excellent job towing those heavier weights, and it has an available integrated trailer brake controller. This particular model does not have one. If you get the trailer brake controller, you also get some tow hooks up front, so the front end design changes just a little bit. But all of these vehicles are rated to tow the higher loads whether you get that particular package or not, because there's really no difference in the transmission or in the cooling system of the engine or in the 6.4-liter V8. Now the 5.7 does have 2 different axle ratios available, but both of them are rated to tow 10,000 pounds. Although the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer are clearly large SUVs, they don't feel quite as large out on the road as something like the Ford Expedition or the Lincoln Navigator sometimes can, or of course the General Motors SUVs either. Turning radius is not exactly small, but it's not as large as some of those options either. Jeep has also done a good job engineering the steering feel. This has a variable ratio and variable assist power steering rack, so that means it gives you a little bit more assist at lower speeds, and at higher speeds like this, the assist is dialed down. The variable ratio means that it has good on-center feel, so you have to turn it a little bit more to get it out of the lane. That helps keep it from feeling twitchy, but then once it's a little bit off-center, the steering is a bit more direct, a little bit faster, to make it feel a bit more nimble out on winding mountain roads. Again, if you were really going to be corner carving in your SUV, you probably want to take a look at a Grand Cherokee, either the regular Grand Cherokee or the Grand Cherokee L, because either of those vehicles will be more dynamic out on the road. Now let's talk about a few things that I didn't cover in part 1 of this video series. When it comes to active safety, this vehicle has all of the latest systems available through the Stellantis portfolio. We have adaptive cruise control, we have autonomous braking with pedestrian detection, there's night vision available, this model does not have it, and we're also going to have the availability of a hands-free driving system sometime a little bit later, although they haven't been overly specific. That system is going to be largely similar to Cadillac Super Cruise and the Ford Blue Cruise system, but what's a little bit different is that this vehicle is not available with that hardware just yet. So if you want the hands-free driving system in your next Grand Wagoneer, you will need to wait and not buy one now. You're going to want to wait until that feature is actually orderable and available. That's why this steering wheel right here doesn't have any lights on it, there's no eye monitoring system right here, etc. We don't know exactly what flavor that is going to take in the Wagoneer, Grand Wagoneer, and Grand Cherokee L, but we know it's going to be available on those vehicles as well as the 2-row Grand Cherokee at some point in calendar year 2022. As with the Cadillac system, this is going to be a level 2 plus system. That means hands off the wheel, but eyes still on the road. And if your eyes are not on the road looking forward, the system is going to remind you that you need to take control and then will eventually give up. Jeep was pretty clear that the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer are not trail-rated SUVs. So this is not a Jeep that was designed to go rock climbing. It's not designed to go to Moab and do the same sort of things that you can do in a Wrangler. Even though Jeep says the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer aren't exactly trail-rated, they definitely wanted all-wheel drive capability and four-wheel drive capability to be best in class. And to prove that, they have built a little off-road course here in upstate New York, where you can definitely see that this vehicle is available with skid plates. It has a robust locking four-wheel drive system with an available e-locker or a regular limited slip rear differential. Decent amount of ground clearance, but of course, with a long wheelbase like this, and of course those running boards, there's definitely going to be less clearance than you'd find in a Grand Cherokee L. And even though curb weight can be over 6,500 pounds, this does a reasonably good job even in off-camber situations. For traction across the rear axle, this uses either a limited slip differential or an e-locker in the rear. For traction across the front axle, it uses a brake-based traction control system with software that's a little bit different than your average. You can see that it's really managing that wheel spin very directly without simply limiting engine torque like we see in a lot of other vehicles. Of course, there's a rock crawling mode, the air suspension with extra ground clearance, and skid plates under the vehicle to help protect all the important parts. And that's definitely important on this particular segment where they made sure that there were certainly rocks that you could bang up against. No Jeep would be complete without a low range, so of course that is available in here as well. It's not standard, but it will give you a 48-to-1 crawl ratio. That's definitely respectable, considering this produces an awful lot of torque from the 6.4-liter V8. As entertaining as it is to go on a mild off-road course in a beast that is this big, obviously this is much more at home out on the road, and that's where most people are going to be driving their Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer. And I have to say, this is an excellently designed vehicle. It is a really, really good balance of on-road ability, a little bit of mild off-road ability, a really great ride, and a great engine exhaust note as well. Now let's take a dive into pricing. The base model, which is not going to be available at launch, will start at $57,995. It's a pretty big bump from that model up to the next trim, the Series 2 Wagoneer, at $67,995. And if you want all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive, whatever you want to call it, that will only be on the Series 2 model for $70,995. So it's very clear that with the Wagoneer and the Grand Wagoneer, Jeep is targeting a very different customer than a base Chevy Tahoe. In a logical world, you're not going to find too many of those base Series 1 models on dealer lots. Instead, stock is probably going to start with the Series 2 at $67,995. That means that this is going to be at least more expensive than a base GMC Yukon Denali. And frankly, that makes a lot of sense because the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer are not just bigger than a base Denali, they're also considerably more premium on the inside. In fact, the interior parts quality of even the base Wagoneer model is considerably above what we find in even the most expensive Yukon Denali. From that point on, pricing ramps up pretty aggressively. The top-end Wagoneer Series 3 starts at $75,995 for four-wheel drive. If you want this little Grand logo on the back of your next Wagoneer, that will set you back at least $86,995, and these prices are, of course, before that pesky destination charge. The Grand Wagoneer Series 2, the model that I spent most of my time with today, this one started at $93,995, and as I have been driving it, this one came in at over $103,000. It's not the only six-figure Grand Wagoneer, however. The Grand Wagoneer Series 3 will start at $103,995,000, and that is going to give you all the bells and whistles, all the gadgets that you've seen in all the advertisements. The most important question that a lot of you were asking on social media is the one that is the most difficult to answer. Are the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer worth their price tags? A lot of this answer has to do with how you feel about the logo on the front of your next vehicle, or the lack thereof, because you'll notice that this does not say Jeep on it really anywhere. There's no Jeep logo on the front, there's no Jeep logo on the back, no Jeep logo on the sides, and even the wheels say Wagoneer. Jeep is also making the purchase process a little bit different. So if you'd like to test drive your Wagoneer or Grand Wagoneer at home without ever going to visit the dealer, you can arrange for a test drive at home, you can purchase the vehicle, have it delivered to your home, and you can have the vehicle picked up for service and then redelivered back to you with a loaner vehicle as well. So the purchase process is going to be perhaps a little bit more luxury-like, but you will still sometimes end up at the Jeep dealer right next to the regular Grand Cherokee or Grand Cherokee L. Personally, I don't think that's a problem at all because as far as the vehicle itself goes, the interior parts quality, the design of the vehicle, the design on the outside, etc., this is certainly a full-on luxury SUV. And this definitely has the chops in terms of the interior style, the interior functionality, the engine power, etc., to compete very directly with the Escalade and the Lincoln Navigator. It's worth noting that the dealer ambiance at the average Lincoln dealer and average Cadillac dealer isn't that far off of the average Jeep dealer. It's certainly not where we see BMW, Mercedes, or Porsche dealers. But speaking of the Germans, honestly, the interior of this vehicle and the level of comfort that we find inside definitely has what it takes to compete with the GLS or the BMW X7 if you're looking for something that's a bit more rugged, body-on-frame designed, etc. So if you're looking to tow and you're looking for luxury on the inside with 8 passengers or 7 passengers and a lot of room, this is going to be an excellent option. Now, very clearly, because of the design, because this is a body-on-frame SUV and it's pretty heavy, it's never going to handle like the top-end performance versions of the Mercedes or the BMW or the Audi, etc. That's not its intent. Instead, this is targeted very directly at the other American full-size SUVs, and I think with that, it does incredibly well. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Would you be willing to pay $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 for your next Jeep Grand Wagoneer or Wagoneer? Personally, I think that if I had the cash, which I don't, mind you, need more subscribers, be sure and click that button down there, then I would definitely put the Grand Wagoneer on my shopping list. When I was taking a look at my Dodge Durango that I recently bought, I was seriously considering the Grand Cherokee L or the Wagoneer, but honestly, the price tag ended up being just a little bit too steep for me personally. I would love to know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. This definitely is the nicest interior that the Stellantis group has ever made. The interior in this vehicle could very easily be transplanted into the next generation Maserati portfolio, and it absolutely would not look out of place.